Today, I'm delivering the 22-23 biennial revenue estimate to policymakers for use during the regular session of the 87th Legislature. This is one of the many duties of the Comptroller's Office and is required under Article 3, Section 49A of the Texas Constitution. My virtual appearance today, in lieu of the typical BRE press conference, is emblematic of the unusual circumstances surrounding this estimate. We find ourselves, as countless commercials have told us over the last 9 months, in unprecedented circumstances. No previous recession or economic slowdown provided us with a relevant comparison to help guide our forecast as we recover from a recession during which economic activity contracted more quickly and deeply than we've experienced in modern times. As I have been noting since spring of last year, this unique economic environment has only heightened the uncertainty already inherent in a revenue forecast with projections that start in 9 months and end more than 2.5 years into the future. Fortunately for Texas, we entered the pandemic on relatively strong economic footing. Thanks to conservative budgeting practices, we started this biennium with $4.8 billion beginning balance in funds available for general purpose spending. And state revenue was running ahead of our 2019 estimate as we entered March of last year, putting us on track to finish the current biennium with another surplus. But the pandemic, which resulted in steep declines in key sources of revenue in the latter half of fiscal 2020 and has continued to drag down revenue collections in fiscal 2021, wiped out a projected positive ending balance for this biennium and has turned it into a currently projected deficit of nearly $1 billion. The details for both 2020-21 and 2022-23 biennium are on this slide. We do expect revenue collections to resume growth in the latter half of fiscal 2021 and for growth to continue into the next biennium, with general revenue related tax collections increasing by 6.7% and total net GRR growing by 6.3% from this biennium to the next. But despite growth in revenue collections, we estimate state revenue available for general purpose spending will be $112.53 billion for 2022-23, a slight decrease from the current biennium. This is because, as I mentioned a moment ago, we started this biennium with a $4.8 billion beginning balance, whereas this estimate projects a $950 million deficit at the beginning of next biennium. We expect $119.58 billion in general revenue related or GRR collections, an increase of more than $7 billion from 2020-21. For that amount, we need to subtract a projected fiscal 2021 ending shortfall of $950 million in GRR funds. Keep in mind, however, that this projected shortfall must be made whole by the 87th Legislature, as we are required in Texas to maintain balanced budgets. This will require cuts in GRR spending from the current biennium, replacing current GRR appropriations with funds from other sources, or some combination of these or similar strategies. I will note here that this estimate does not include any possible savings from the 5% cuts agencies were asked to identify last summer. Those spending reductions, if realized via reduced appropriations, could eliminate the projected ending shortfall. On the other hand, any new GR appropriations needed in a supplemental appropriations bill for this biennium would increase the projected deficit. After subtracting the projected ending shortfall from estimated revenue collections, we then have to deduct $5.83 billion in severance tax revenues that must be reserved for transfers to the economic stabilization and state highway funds. We must also set aside general revenue to cover a projected shortfall in the Texas Tomorrow Fund, the state's original prepaid college tuition program. Because Tomorrow Fund contracts are constitutionally guaranteed, any shortfall must be paid by the state. We expect the shortfall to be $270 million in the coming biennium. That leaves us with a projection of $112.53 billion available for general purpose spending, including federal funds and constitutionally dedicated funds that can only be spent for designated purposes. we are projecting more than $270 billion in all funds revenue for the 2022-23 biennium. Tax revenues account for 87% of our projected GRR collections, and sales taxes, after $5 billion is allocated to the State Highway Fund as authorized by the Texas Constitution, are projected to comprise more than 60% of GRR tax collections. Fortunately, sales tax collections, though down significantly over the last 9 months compared to the same period a year ago, have performed better than we expected when the pandemic first caused a sharp contraction in economic activity. As consumer behavior shifted during the pandemic, Texas benefited from the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the Wayfair case, which required out-of-state online retailers selling their goods to Texas consumers to collect taxes on those sales, and from the 86th Legislature's subsequent passage of House Bill 1525, which required online marketplace providers to collect and remit sales taxes for the sales made on their platform. As you can see from the chart on the left side of this slide, sales tax remittances from remote sellers and marketplace providers, which started in November of 2019, climbed sharply starting in April 2020, and by July exceeded January's remittances, which reflected December holiday sales. In the first 12 months of such collections, state sales tax revenue from remote sellers and marketplace providers totaled nearly $1.3 billion. For the most part, this is revenue that the state was not previously collecting. As you can see from the chart in the lower right of this slide, monthly sales tax collections have been down compared to the prior year in 8 of the last 9 months. But if not for the tax collections from online sellers, they would have been down even more. Other sources of tax revenue did not fare as well, with severance, hotel occupancy, and alcohol beverage taxes getting hit the hardest by the pandemic. Though they have rebounded some from their lows, some of them continue to be down by more than 40% compared to a year ago. Travel has been down sharply during the pandemic, resulting in reduced collections from hotel occupancy and motor fuel taxes. Dining and drinking at restaurants and bars has been limited, thus reducing collections of mixed beverage taxes, which make up the vast majority of our alcohol beverage taxes. Consistent with our revenue trends, Texas employment peaked in February, but then the state lost more than 1.4 million jobs in just 2 months. Job growth rebounded sharply starting in May, but as of November, Texas still had nearly 570,000 fewer jobs than in February. And job losses as a share of the pre-pandemic peak remain deeper than Texas experienced in its worst months during the Great Recession. Despite substantial improvement from the worst weeks of spring, initial claims for unemployment remain elevated relative to pre-pandemic levels, indicating ongoing weakness in our labor market. Our revenue forecast is based on an assumption of continued economic growth through the next biennium, but there remains uncertainty about the ultimate course of the economy and thus state revenue. And unfortunately, the economic damage done by the pandemic has created a hole that it will take some time to climb out of. The prospect of effective and widely administered vaccines generates hope for a return to pre-pandemic levels of economic activity in the next year, though the near term could see a reversal of recent positive trends due to the recent surge in cases and hospitalizations. The recent resurgence of infections is almost certainly a drag on economic growth and recovery. However, we do not expect a repeat of the contraction that we saw in the spring of 2020. The oil and gas industry is still a significant contributor to the Texas economy and state revenues, yet it remains tied to volatile energy prices. Oil prices are difficult to forecast, and energy markets have a history of large swings up and down. April 2020 brought an unprecedented and historical event for the energy market when future prices turned sharply negative for a day. Texas rig count, which had started drifting lower in 2019, collapsed this past summer to levels not seen in more than 50 years of data available to us. This affects not just severance tax revenue, but sales tax and other state revenue tied to the activity in the industry. Though rig count has recovered some in recent months, it remains well below levels of just 1 year ago and is a continued drag on economic and revenue growth. Energy markets, as always, are a significant source of great uncertainty in Texas economic and revenue forecasts. Some of this forecast uncertainty, however, is tied to the potential for revenue collections over the next 2.5 years to exceed our expectations. Personal savings rates are elevated as people spent less of their total income, including enhanced governmental benefits, in the first 3 quarters of 2020 than they spent in previous years. And some consumer debt has decreased at the same time. These and other factors suggest that there may be capacity for a substantial surge in consumer spending once pandemic concerns have receded. Before I close, I will note that in addition to the potential savings from the 5% spending cuts at state agencies, some of the federal CARES Act funding, as well as revenue coming to the state as a result of relief package passed in late December, could be used to replace some GR spending, which could substantially improve the projected ending shortfall for this biennium, possibly turning it into a surplus. And of course, the state has a substantial resource available to it in the Economic Stabilization Fund, the balance of which we project will reach $11.6 billion by the end of fiscal 2023, absent any new appropriations from the fund. Texas is well positioned to eventually recover from the COVID outbreak and return to its norm of economic growth in excess of the national rate. As is always the case, this estimate is based on the information we have available. It represents our efforts to provide lawmakers with the most accurate information possible as they craft the budget for both the 22-23 biennium and the supplemental spending bill to address the remainder of the current biennium. The forecast, however, remains clouded with uncertainty. The ultimate path of the pandemic and the behavior of consumers and businesses during the resurgence is difficult to gauge. It is also unclear how they will respond once the pandemic is fully under control. As a result, there is a wide range of possible outcomes for state revenue through the end of fiscal 2023, with the possibility of revenue falling short of this forecast, but also a chance revenue could exceed it, perhaps substantially. Regardless, the legislature will again face some difficult choices to balance the budget. Whereas savings from formal recognition of agency spending cuts and federal funding could help erase a projected shortfall this biennium, a substantial supplemental appropriations bill could increase it, thereby reducing revenue available for next biennium. As always, I stand ready to assist the 87th legislature, and I will of course update this estimate if new data warrants an update. At this time, I will be glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Comptroller Hegar. I understand we had just a brief cutout there at the very end of the presentation, but it sounds like we are back up and running. Those of you who are in attendance today, we ask that you feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature of the MS Teams live platform. If the Q&A feature is not already up on your screen right now, you can find it by clicking on the 2 small dialogue, the icons on the top of your screen, the ones with the small question mark in there. It's 2 little dialogue boxes with a question mark in there. A note to our audience members, you're welcome to ask questions anonymously. We do ask as a courtesy for members of the press or for legislative staff members that you please enter your name and affiliation in the Your Name field, and then just enter the question in the Ask a Question field. Our moderators will be posing those questions to the controller as time permits. Once again, please feel free to ask questions anonymously, but we will, if you are a member of the press or a legislative staffer, it would be helpful for us if you were able to identify yourself and the affiliated media outlet. Thank you again for joining us, Comptroller Hegar. We do have a few questions already in the queue. The first one is, I think, probably the question on everyone's mind at the moment. This BRE is small, shows us a smaller shortfall for the biennium than you projected in July. What would you say accounts for that difference?
Yeah, essentially, the largest portion of that is revenues into the state treasury, principally from sales tax collections, have not been as negative as we anticipated. Also, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, having the online sales tax requirement from the Wayfair decision has substantially helped Texas. Being in the first 12 months of implementation was an additional $1.3 billion that the Treasury essentially would not have gathered by creating that equal playing field of making sure that we pay sales tax at the local store around the corner. We also pay it and collect it on marketplace providers and remote sellers. So principally, sales tax collections have not been as negative as we originally anticipated, which is good news. However, as I noted earlier, also, unfortunately, some tax collections have continued to be substantially lower, more specifically oil and gas severance tax collections, alcohol, mixed beverage tax collections, and then also having hotel occupancy tax collections. But really, the largest part of it is revenues higher than we anticipated. Also, there have been some fewer costs for the state treasury than was anticipated. Principally, the foundation school fund was slightly less than we had anticipated, so those in combined have helped the better situation. And just kind of a side note, the better trend for collections has not only been here in Texas, but most states have been pleasantly surprised that while they've continued to be negative, collections have not been as negative as was originally anticipated back last summer.
Thank you, Controller. You covered a little bit of the next question that we have from Bob Garrett of the Dallas Morning News. Bob asked, can you describe what factors reduced your July CRE estimate? He has a follow-up question to that, in which he asks, you're not counting the 5% cuts currently requested from leadership. Could you go into a little bit of the detail of the things that are not included in this? Again, I know you covered that, but maybe we could
be happy to. So as to the first one, Bob and everybody, just in fact, again, revenues have not been as negative as we anticipated. Sales tax, in particular, marketplace providers have increased in the dollars that we've received. As I mentioned, 1.3 billion in the first 12 months, which also means local government received an additional over $300 million, around 350 plus million in those same 12 months, which is good news for everybody. But then particularly people have continued to spend as they're working home, teleworking, have done a tremendous amount of work in and around the home improvement projects, workout equipment, outdoor type activities. So retail has been higher, has really been the one that's been positive, whereas most other sales tax collections categories have remained negative. But again, consumer spending in the retail area has been better than we anticipated, and also, again, principally a large boost by online tax collections. And then far as what's not included in the revenue estimate, just historically from a functioning standpoint, when the legislature comes back into legislative session and takes proactive action to essentially reduce the expenditures that leadership had instructed state agencies. I've said in many different speeches over the course of the last several months that we anticipate that savings will be around $1 billion. However, far as formal recognition doesn't occur until legislature comes into session and takes official action to essentially recapture those cuts that agencies were instructed to. So again, we think that'll be somewhere around $1 billion, but again, it depends on the actions of the legislature. And then also, as I mentioned, any swap in revenues, expenditures from GRR, general related revenue, to federal dollars, some of the federal dollars that we have received so far in the CARES funding, prior act funds, as well as the last round, and then whether Congress does any other type of actions, those are not taken into account right now. However, we do know it'll be a substantial amount of money depending on what actions the legislature takes for some of the expenditures that we may have had originally that would have been state money that now will be federal money. So again, we think the roughly $1 billion deficit that's currently projected in this 2-year budget will essentially be pretty much closer to zero. However, again, it depends on whatever supplemental appropriations the legislature will take as they need to get through expenses through the end of this current biennium, which again ends August of this year.
Thank you, Controller. As a reminder, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature That is the 2 dialog boxes with the small question mark in them. We've had a number of questions on a couple of different topics here. If we don't ask your question specifically, it's likely because a very similar question has been asked. There's a number of questions covering oil and gas, energy, as well as education funding. I'll go ahead and ask from Ross Ramsey of the Texas Tribune. The energy sector taxes seem to be looking better than might have been expected. What is the timing of that recovery in your projections?
Yeah, currently in our current revenue forecast that we're laying out today, we think for this fiscal year, oil is really going to remain about the mid 40s, moving slowly up to roughly almost $50 a barrel, $49 in the first year of the fiscal, and then move into the mid 50s. Now, obviously, it's taken a slight tick up here in the last 5 days. We'll continue to monitor. Obviously, we all know that oil and gas revenues and prices are extremely volatile. I like to sometimes point out that the New York Market Exchange expects 95% certainty. Oil prices are going to be somewhere between the mid 20s and the mid 80s. So, it's always such a wide range being that it's volatile, but we think oil will continue from a production level decrease. It will slightly increase in the coming year, and prices will slowly recover, but we don't think that, there's going to be a drastic recovery in either prices nor production, at least for the next 12 or 18 months.
Thank you, Controller. So as I mentioned, there's a number of questions on education and the commitments that the legislature made during the last session. I'll just go with the most straightforward one. Jason Miles of KHOU asks, any thoughts on potential impacts to education-related funding?
Yeah, I will say, needless to say, I've had a lot of conversations with members of the legislature since we started the dual headwinds here in Texas back in March of 2020 with the pandemic and lower oil prices and production prices. And every single conversation that I have had with members that revolve around public education as well as state leadership is everybody continues to maintain the commitments that they made last legislative session to public education. And a lot of the questions that I received early on specifically focused in that area because people were concerned how drastic the economy would be impacted here in the state of Texas, and specifically wanting to make sure that the commitments that they made were going to be there. So I think there's a very strong commitment by the legislature, and I think the position that we're in today, with all things said, they'll be able to continue to make those commitments this legislative session.
Thank you, sir. We've also had a number of questions about CARES Act dollars and additional federal stimulus money. Could you expand a little bit on one? I know you mentioned that we have not taken that into account in this estimate, but could you expand a little bit on the potential for that money to be used and how you've seen that money spent to date?
So obviously a certain amount of those dollars were directed to specific expenses or purposes, whether that's higher education, public education, daycare, other types of expenses that the legislature or the state was supposed to spend it in parameters of the federal dollars. And then also a large portion of the money for the state of Texas was for COVID type expenses. Now the deadline to be able to spend that was December of last year. However, in the last package that Congress passed, that got extended into this calendar year. So that's given leadership and legislature more ability to make sure that those dollars are effectively and properly spent, as well as where they want to spend those dollars, which is good news for Texas. And so therefore, the last round of dollars, the additional stimulus check dollars that Congress passed for the second round, any dollars that are floating into the economy are obviously some of them are going to be spent. And that's positive news for the immediate impact of the state economy. Nothing to significantly change the needle overall, but again, any dollars that are being spent in the economy is obviously going to continue to help the economy. But far as specifically the federal dollars that have been received to date, we know that a substantial amount of that will be able to swap for general revenue. However, waiting on final details from leadership to know exactly what those dollars will be as they roll up their sleeves and get to work tomorrow in the legislative session.
Thank you. We have a question from Richard Williamson of the Bond Buyer, who asks, how will this estimate affect funding for highway projects? I know that is a question that we received from a number of different outlets as well.
Yeah, originally we had thought that highway funding, specifically from severance tax collections, the full amount of sales tax collections, the 2.5 billion that was dedicated several sessions ago for highway funding, is going to continue to happen. We're going to meet the thresholds that we need in the state of Texas for that full 2.5 billion to be spent. The portion that's really significantly impacted, or to some degree, is severance tax collections. Now, originally we thought that number would be a little over $1 billion less highway funding than originally anticipated before the pandemic. That number has improved slightly because oil prices have increased slightly, as well as production. However, there still is some amount that's going to be unfortunately impacted. But then when we set that up in place, I was in the legislature when we passed that in the state Senate, and we all knew that oil and gas prices are going to go up, they're going to go down, production volumes are going to go up, they're going to go down. It's the most volatile stream of revenue that the state treasury has. However, with that being said, we knew that the numbers are going to adjust from year to year. But the fact is, any dollars that we're able to put into highway transportation is a good thing. And so it'll still be a substantial amount of money going over to the state highway fund, just slightly less than we had anticipated, obviously, before the pandemic hit.
Thank you, Controller. We've had a number of staff members ask a question. I'll just kind of pick one. Lawmakers in past sessions have welcomed upward revisions in the amount of revenue available to them. Does this difficult economic situation make it more or less likely that you'll have good news for lawmakers later in the session?
Well, one thing that I can guarantee, the revenue estimate that we're providing today is going to be the revenue estimate tomorrow, and it's going to be the same one next week and next month. So I can tell you with certainty with that. But I've also said in almost every speech that I've given, and I've given a lot of them by this forum here virtually for the last 10 months, is that we need a couple more months of data. I've been saying that since March of last year. I'm still saying that today because, again, forecasting a state economy, the 9th largest in the entire world, for a revenue estimate that doesn't start for 9 more months and ends 2 years later, numbers are going to adjust and change. Now, whether those adjust and change enough to warrant an increase or decrease in the revenue forecast, this cycle, probably that's higher than before. And so I've been saying that, I expect that we may adjust those numbers come April or May before the legislature again, as we get a couple more months of data. However, I think that as of the data we have today, all factors included, I think that this is a very accurate and best reflection we can provide. However, again, we're constantly looking at the data, the numbers, monitoring all types of our normal things we look at, non-traditional economic indicators. And then again, large portion of it's going to be, what is the supplemental appropriation for this cycle? What are the dollars that are going to be saved because of the state agency cuts, even though we think we have a good idea, but that formal action taken by the legislature, and then also federal dollars as those are essentially being spent instead of general revenue. All of those things combined, I think, we'll need to probably adjust something towards the back end of session. And hopefully the vaccine rollout continues. Hopefully it goes smoother, as well as consumer confidence continues to increase, because the more that we have confidence as consumers, the better the economy is going to recover here in Texas, the U.S., and around the world.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned the supplemental, and we do have a number of questions on the supplemental. Freddie Warner of Memorial Hermann asks any thoughts regarding the amount of anticipated Medicaid shortfall, and several people kind of asked for general thoughts on what makes up the supplemental and what types of kind of holes is that supplemental budget meant to fill?
So typically when the legislature comes in and puts a budget together, they're again putting a budget like I'm putting a revenue forecast that doesn't start for many months and then ends 2 years after it begins in September of this year that they're budgeting. And the fact is, with Medicaid dollars, public education funding, you're never going to get it right exactly. I mean, the numbers adjust, change, the economic times, how many people are going to be on the Medicaid rolls, how many people are going to be in the public school system. And so therefore, when you come back into session, you know that you're going to make some adjustment. And so typically that Medicaid number might be several $100 million. This one, I think, if memory serves, is probably closer to not quite at $1.5 billion, but we're looking forward to getting a revision from Health and Human Services as what their estimates are. And so therefore that, as well as whether there's going to be some type of additional dollars that in the past, sometimes for child support services, sometimes for teacher retirement system, sometimes for teacher care, the healthcare system. And so all those taken into account. Typically, those are the largest ones, Medicaid being the largest one typically. However, this one, it seems as though as today, maybe that potential supplemental appropriation is around $1.5 billion. But then again, we haven't got the most, as the legislature goes through the next several months, we'll see exactly what those numbers are going to be.
Thank you. We've had a number of questions on the rainy day fund and your thoughts on that. Brad Johnson of the Texan asks, have legislators indicated to you any plans of pulling from the ESF this session, whether it is for COVID-related expenses or other initiatives?
Well, I would say that, obviously here in Texas, we have a pretty conservative budgeting practice, and we like to make sure that we have a strong economic stabilization fund. And with that, we've talked a lot over the last many years, what is a good balance in that fund to save for a rainy day. And even though we are still in the throes, unfortunately, of a pandemic, we still need to make sure that we save a healthy balance for the next legislative session, because you don't know what's going to come up on the horizon. So the legislature has talked about using a portion of that if they need to. However, I think as we get into the legislative session, have a little bit better idea of what the supplemental appropriation is going to be, what are the federal dollars that are being able to be utilized instead of general revenue, and then continue to see what the trends are. And I think the trends are really important from the economy here in the next couple of months, at least to get us through March. Unfortunately, we've had some numbers increase with COVID because of around the Christmas holidays and New Year holidays. And as we're getting through the parts of winter to see what those trends are, obviously we're dealing with it much better than we were in the very beginning, like most places in the world. And so therefore the short answer is, I know the legislature's always, it's on the table. However, the fact is, it doesn't look like they'll have to use a substantial portion of the ESF during this cycle. But again, those are the decisions that they're going to be making here in the upcoming months.
Richard Williamson of the Bond Buyer has a follow-up question that I think is kind of speaks to maybe a broader question. He asked, can you comment on the impact of the fall off of the hotel occupancy tax collections might have? I think maybe a broader question that a number we've seen in a few different places is, which of those taxes that you went over were really the hardest hit, and what are we seeing as the impacts sort of more broadly from those taxes?
Yeah, so, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, that we still have around 570,000 fewer jobs than before the pandemic. And so, we had significant loss in jobs. Many of those have been gained back here in Texas and in the US, but principally the hardest hit sectors have been the hotel industry, vacation, hospitality, leisure. Those areas have been hard hit. Retail, obviously restaurants and bars that were temporarily closed, some of them continuing with reduced amount of traffic that they're able to have brought in either by reduced capacity numbers and or just consumer choices right now. So those areas have been impacted, which again has had double-digit impacts to hotel occupancy tax collections, as well as the mixed beverage tax collections from restaurants and hotels. Now we've seen an offset on some of those. One thing I've learned during this pandemic, that whether you're in a pandemic, whether you're in a good economy, people continue to still consume alcohol in some shape, form, or fashion. And so that has shifted in part from those restaurants and those bars and shifted over into whether it's going to the convenience store, liquor stores. And so therefore those are sales tax collections. So some of that has been offset in other areas. But again, principally we've seen and continue to see as travel has been reduced, either individual and or business, more impacts there in the hotel, leisure, hospitality, and travel industries than other areas.
We've also had a number of questions on the specifics of the 5% cuts requested by leadership. Could you go into a little bit of detail? Jack Fink asks what is on a lot of folks' minds. Jack Fink of KTVT in Dallas asks, how much money would the 5% cuts in funding requested by leadership amount to?
So first, you have to always recall, many of us make sure to restate that those 5% cuts does not include public education funding, does not include anything in Medicaid, and so therefore those are the two largest expenses. So typically, when you exempt those, which need to be, one's a constitutional right, one's an entitlement, so those cannot be touched, as well as certain areas of law enforcement, a few other areas were exempt by leadership, and so then you really get down to about 1/3 of the state budget is required to have those cuts. Now, the timing of when they were implemented was partway through the current 2-year budget cycle. So that 5% cut was the entire 24 months of the biennium, where in fact, several of those months, as I mentioned, had already passed. So it really included a little, probably more like 8.5% cut for the months that was remaining. And in essence, we think that that probably is going to amount to about $1 billion for that 1/3 portion of the state government, which are really kind of the business functions of the state, are the areas that are going to have implemented the cuts. Those dollars are being retained in the Treasury. They're actually being saved in the Treasury right now. But then far as formal recognition is when the legislature takes action. But again, that number is probably around plus or minus $1 billion.
Thank you, sir. We have a number of folks who read an op-ed that you published just yesterday in the Dallas Morning News, in which you discussed some of the more long-term things that you're looking at as far as the fiscal health of the state. Could you touch on some of the issues like the pension expenses and related long-term balance sheet issues that you were discussed in that op-ed?
Yeah, one of the things that I feel like, at least as my role as controller, as CFO for the state of Texas, is also continuing to make sure to highlight the longer term, not just the current 2-year budget cycle that the legislature is going to wrap up, as well as the next 2-year biennium, but what's on the horizon for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And that's something that I've been talking about ever since I got into this job since 2015. And over that time, as I highlighted in that op-ed, the legislature has taken very positive steps in transportation funding, has taken very positive steps in water infrastructure funding. Last session took positive steps in flood control type funding, as well as public education funding. But one of the areas that we need to focus more on, we're not in the same shape as other states from their pension system, either their employee retirement pensions and or teacher retirement pensions. Teachers are in a better shape than the employees' pension shapes. But if we don't continue to take better strides in those areas, I don't want Texas to be in the shape that a New Jersey is in, that a Kentucky or an Illinois. Some of those states have essentially swept that under the rug for too long, and the unfunded liability has gotten bigger. And so therefore, I continue to talk about the pension system. And that's one reason that I talked a couple of sessions about the Texas Legacy Fund concept with the ESF dollars that we have. I continue to talk about that as part of a potential solution, just again to highlight, as the legislature is working on this legislative session, we got to meet the needs of the state budget for the remaining 9 months in this biennium, the next 2-year budget cycle, but we also need to continue to be looking out in the future of what those burdens will be placed on future generations here in the state if we don't take appropriate action. And so pensions is really the biggest one that I continue to highlight more than any of the other liability issues from a longer term perspective.
Thank you, sir. It looks like we have a number of legislative staffers and members of the media who've been covering the budget for some time. We've had a few questions that ask how this shortfall compares to budget challenges that lawmakers faced in previous sessions, including the 2011 legislative session, which you were a part of.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I have memories of the 2011 session as well as the 2003 session. My very first session as a state legislator, we had a $10 billion shortfall in 2003, not just for the current 2-year biennium, but the upcoming 2-year biennium. And then when we were coming in 2011, which was a very, very rough budgeting cycle, we were entering with about $4.5 billion deficit in the current 2-year budget, as well as for the upcoming one, it was forecasted a little over $20 billion. And so I think total we had $27 billion between the two. Now this one obviously have a $953 million deficit in the current budget cycle, taking into account the reduced expenses, taking into account federal dollars, taking into account as well as any supplemental appropriation. This current 2-year budget cycle is in much better shape, I think, compared to both of those. Now, again, the question becomes, what is the direction of the economy in the upcoming 3 and 4 months, the upcoming trajectory that we are going to be on here in Texas? And so there's great potential that it could be from one direction to the next, but this budgeting cycle, while the legislature still is going to have to make some tough budgeting decisions, it is not anywhere compared to what 2011 or, in my opinion, in 2003 was in. Fortunately for the legislature, fortunately for all of us here in the state of Texas.
We have a question from an anonymous questioner who asked, the expansion of the sales tax to remote sales was a very important updating of our tax system to reflect the changing economy. What other changes could be made to keep the state revenue up with changing economic structures? I know you have a change that you're kind of proposing, dealing specifically with some of these online retailing and the way those taxes are sourced.
Yeah, I think as the economy changes, as technology changes, it's extremely important that we continue to make sure that we have a fairness in the system. And from my opinion, I talk continually about whether it's marketplace providers, those that we go online and purchase through their platforms, and or remote sellers that may sell directly to us via the internet, that they are collecting and remitting sales tax just like the store down the street. So it's a fairness issue. We continue to see obviously significant changes in technology. How do we make sure that those technological changes we keep up with and that fairness in the system? Also, one of the issues that we have talked about, and we've implemented a rule change, as in where are those sales taxes from a local perspective? When we go and purchase items from a business, where are those dollars going to? And I think updating and making sure that we are consistent with what the legislature has put into place from sales tax, not just from a state revenue, but also from a local revenue source, that they're going to their intended purposes. And so therefore, I think, from us and my vantage point and working with the members, we continue to look at what technology changes there are and what do we need to do to make sure that we continue to keep that fairness and that equal playing field into the tax system.
Thank you, sir. We have just a few more minutes, so I would ask that if you have not yet submitted your questions, please do so. We are working our best to try to get through to all those questions. If we don't get to your question, we will provide some contact information at the end of the presentation to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask that question, and we have the opportunity to get back with you on that question. So please, again, if you are waiting to ask a question, please do so now. The Q&A feature is available at the top of the screen. It is the two dialog boxes with the question mark in there. Controller, I think we had a little bit of technical difficulty at the very end of your presentation, and I think maybe people didn't have a chance to hear some of the potential uncertainty on the positive side. I think a lot of people are aware of what we're grappling with on the negative side of things. But James Labaugh asks, is there a guess as to when most of Texans will have been vaccinated? I think that is kind of part of a broader question of, given the positive potential out there, what is the upside that you see here?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of upsides, and one of the things, sorry that part cut out from technical issues. So is the day of the continued pandemic and trying to do things in a web format. But in essence, there's been a significant amount of savings. So savings in Texas and the United States is at very high levels. People have had significant amount of money that they have received, some of them discretionary dollars from either federal stimulus dollars, additional unemployment benefits. Again, as you look at this pandemic, some people are significantly hurting, unfortunately. Others, their lives continue to go in a direction and continuing to have activity economically that just in a different format. And so therefore, there is a substantial potential for the economy to have significant uptick in the upcoming 18 months, the upcoming 36 months. And so therefore that wide range is really hard. I've had discussions with many economists, and one thing that I have continually learned from them is no one knows, unfortunately, the direction of the economy. And so therefore, at least from my vantage point, what's important is to continue to manage expectations of everyone from the data that we see. what is the expectations of the direction of the economy. So while there continues to be the drag of lower oil prices in the pandemic, there is also some potential upside if all the stars align. Now, again, it's somewhere in between the two, and we've got to take all the data that we have and best accurately reflect what is that trajectory. And so therefore, with that uncertainty, that's one reason that I continue to make a point. A couple more months of data now is more important than ever before since I've been in this job.
Absolutely. We do have a question about sort of your thoughts on real estate. We've seen a couple of these. I'm going to go ahead and ask Curtis's from the Texas School Alliance, who asked, have we seen any negative indicators through bankruptcy filings or property tax collections for commercial property in the real estate sector? And I know you've made a distinction between commercial and residential real estate.
Right. So that was what I was first going to mention, that is that in residential, I think we've all seen that residential values have contained their level and actually increased. Demand is very strong, continues to be here in the state of Texas. Maybe there's not as many showings as there used to be, but the buyers that are interested are very serious. And so they're, as a result of less supply, not able to have as many construction projects during the pandemic, residential continues to stay very strong. Whereas the question marks continue to be, what is commercial? We all know oil and gas prices are going to be down come as of today or January 1 of this year as evaluation. Commercial values are probably going to be slightly down, maybe some of the retail areas. But what's interesting, people still have a demand, businesses have a demand to continue to move to Texas. So while we are seeing a potential restructuring of what downtown areas may be in other parts of the United States and the world, that is not so much here in Texas. Texas continues to be an attractive state to move to for a job, to set up a business, to expand a business, corporate relocations. And so therefore, those things have continued to make sure that Texas, I think, from a valuation standpoint, is in much better shape than maybe a New York, a Chicago, a LA, that may have more of an adjustment in their prices than what we're going to see here in the state of Texas.
Once again, we have a kind of a last call for questions here. I'm going to try to get through a few here in the last few minutes that we have. Jeremy Blackman of the Houston Chronicle asked a question that I think is on a number of people's minds. He specifically asked the Biden administration / the next Congress has plans for additional stimulus. How could that impact your projection? And I think more broadly, you know, what remind folks what you're looking at and how you're approaching federal stimulus money.
Yeah, so the biggest important part, at least from an impact to the state treasury, is what dollars the state in itself receives and how are those dollars being allocated by the legislature and by leadership. That will be the biggest impact to the overall bottom line of the state treasury. However, far as an additional stimulus shot or adrenaline shot into the state economy, any dollars that come in forms of the state of Texas, originally when we were preparing this, we were not taking into account even additional federal dollars, even though Congress had been talking about it for months, because part of the question was exactly where were they going to put it? Were they going to put it for additional dollars to individuals? Was it going to be for essentially employee protection? Was it going to specific industries? And so even though now we have an idea because Congress passed the last bill and they're talking about another one, those will impact the overall economy to have a little bit better trajectory. However, it's not going to be something that significantly changes the needle on a drastic curve. So all of those things are important pieces that can help, but it's not one that's going to just drastically overall change the trajectory of the revenue forecast that we provided today. The biggest piece, again, dollars that come to the state of Texas, those obviously to the state treasury are the ones that'll biggest impact to the overall revenue estimate and any adjustments that we'll make before the end of legislative session.
Thank you, sir. Tyler asks, last session, legislature passed HB 20 HJR 10, which proposed to create a legacy fund to pay for long-term obligations of the state. He asks, has this generated any new revenue for the next biennium? I might broaden that out and say, how important is it for us to be kind of finding some of those additional revenue streams and treating our money wisely?
Yeah, I'll just, the short of it was when I got in this job back in 2015, even though as a member I'd been a legislator for several years, I knew the state controller's office was in charge of essentially investing in the state economic stabilization fund. And we had about $6.5 billion at the time. And so I started asking the questions, how do we invest that? And we were required by state statute, in essence, to keep it in the state treasury pool, which means overnight cash. Now, no one's going to keep $6.5 billion in overnight cash. So I immediately began talking to the legislature, giving us more flexibility, not to try to implement into, risky strategies, just basic things that we would all do to preserve that core corpus of the Economic Stabilization Fund, but also make sure that we try to make a little bit more on the return to make sure that the purchasing power of those dollars are there. Now, the legislature in several subsequent sessions have given us more flexibility, and in doing that, we have made a better return on those dollars for the state of Texas and for the taxpayers, several $100 million, which again, hundreds of millions of dollars is not going to overall change the overall health of the Treasury overnight, yet year after year after year, those dollars add up. And so therefore, I think it's important to make sure that we have that flexibility that the legislature has given us, as well as greater flexibility, and is make sure as long as we were open, we're transparent with all the dollars, to make sure the legislature, the public knows exactly how we are investing those dollars and making sure the legislature has them for when they need for that true rainy day, then therefore the state of Texas is going to be in a better shape to make sure that we're managing our dollars in a very fiduciary, responsible manner for the state taxpayers.
Thank you, sir. Aaliyah from the Texas Tribune, I believe, Aaliyah, you're from the Texas Tribune. The cost estimate for HB3 over time grows because of the tax compression element. Is Texas on track to be able to pay for that in the future? And are there other revenue streams available?
I think the biggest question is what is the trajectory of the state economy? So as long as the state economy, many members ask me, the public ask me, what are the best forms of taxation? Obviously, the most volatile is severance taxes, which is one reason that last session, if anyone asked the question, should we use that for funding public education? And my answer was quickly, no, because they're extremely volatile and you want to make sure that you don't use such a volatile revenue stream. However, with that being said, obviously the additional dollars we get from severance tax collections, whether it's a state savings account or putting some over for transportation, it's important to use those and put them to work if we're going to collect them. But the fact is, the biggest question mark is always the trajectory of the state economy. Texas is poised to once again start outpacing the national economy in the next upcoming year, which we have historically outpaced. And so the answer to your question really depends on the trajectory of the state economy. So as long as the state economy is continuing to grow, that enables the legislature more flexibility to meet the obligations that they have committed to in the past, as well as the growth of the state, making sure from infrastructure, water funding, public school transportation, all of those combined, it really depends on the trajectory of the state economy.
I think we will give Kimberly Reeves of the Quorum Report our last question here today. Are we expecting the Texas Tomorrow Fund to be a continuing expense each session? I know you mentioned about $270 million will be taken out of the projected revenues to meet that expense this session. Are we expecting that to be a continued expense?
So that is going to be a continued expense for the next decade or more. However, this session, next session, it'll be even less. So over time, as the people who bought into the Texas Tomorrow Fund, for those individuals to go to college, go to university, the numbers continue to decrease over the course of the years because that fund was originally closed. The next Texas Tomorrow Fund was opened. And so therefore, from an actuarial standpoint, as those people use their credits, the numbers continue to go down. This $270 million for this upcoming biennium will be less in the next biennium, and even less in the next biennium. So it continues to get much more manageable. Now, it will probably still continue to be out there for 20 or 30 years from a very small standpoint, because some people who plan to go to college didn't go, and it can pass on to the next generation. And so, but those dollars will be so de minimis as we once get out here another decade or so. So yes, but it'll continue to go down, and eventually it'll be just really a rounding error.
Well, thank you again for your time, sir. This concludes this morning's biennial revenue estimate presentation. I know there are still a couple of questions left in the queue that have stayed unanswered. We apologize for not getting to everyone today. I think we covered the bulk of what we were trying to set out. That said, we do hope to be able to answer everyone's questions. If you didn't get a question answered today and really want to get that question answered, we're going to put a slide up here that will provide you with a little bit of information regarding how you can reach out to us. All of the materials that were used in today's presentation, as well as the BRE itself, are available on the Comptroller's website. If you go to controller.texas.gov and navigate to our media center, you'll be able to find a link to all of the presentation materials that were used today, as well as a recording of today's presentation. For those of you who really need to watch it immediately one more time, I know there are a couple of budget, revenue, and data nerds out there like me who want to just watch this over and over again. But the link, the attendee link that you used to join today will be available to replay the broadcast in its entirety immediately following the closing of this live event. So if you want to turn around and watch it all again, if you missed anything, if you need to be reminded of any of the numbers that the controller shared today, that link will provide a full recording, including the Q&A section of this presentation as soon as this live event closes. There's some contact information up on your screen today. Please feel free to send us an email if we didn't get to your question. And again, please visit the Comptroller's website if you are looking to download any of the materials. There's also some media resources there, some screen captures and things like that if you are putting together stories or need clips from this. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you feel prepared for the kickoff of session tomorrow. Thank you again to Controller Hegar, and thank you to all of the Controller staff played a part in making this possible today. This concludes the 2021 biennial revenue estimate.